one of the main factors that influences the current biodiversity loss everywhere in the planet is related to our destruction of habitats. Humans have been exploiting the planet for thousands of years, and one of the main impacts that we had is to remove whole habitats from the place, and that happens either because we transform them into something like crops, or because we use more strong activities like fires to actually overexploit, at least transiently, ecosystems that were pristine. And as a consequence of habitat fragmentation and destruction, species vanish from the planet quickly. In this seminar, we will explain how we can address mathematically the problem of the impact of habitat fragmentation and habitat loss on promoting extinction. It might seem a topic not so connected with bioengineering, but in a later seminar, we'll see how this applies to understanding one potential therapy for cancer. But I especially like this example because it illustrates how apparently intuitive ideas that we might have are denied by reality, and how a simple mathematical model can actually shed light into why some things that are not intuitive happen. And extinction and the habitat loss is an example. Imagine that to make a model, I consider my system, my habitat, right, as a square lattice, okay, so a two-dimensional system, where essentially I have three types of states, okay? I have a species, to make it very simple, a single species that can thrive in some particular location. My location here can be a patch of habitat of different size, could be one tree, could be a given number of trees, for example. And my species, when I plot one circle here, doesn't mean necessarily to be one individual. It could be just a population, right? A small population. Sometimes this is called a meta-population system. So I can have this patch occupied. The patch could be empty because there's no individuals there. Or, and that's the way I introduce habitat loss, the patch is totally inaccessible because it has been destroyed. It cannot be occupied, all right? Very good. So the way I just defined, you see I have a finite number of patches, right? And these patches can be distributed in this way, right? So let me call X, right, the number of occupied patches, right? That will give you the population size, right? So I want to make a model where essentially I want to introduce a couple of simple rules. Here, destroyed habitat is a fixed amount, right? So what is destroyed, it doesn't change over time. What changes is the occupation of the places that are available, the empty sites, okay? So I will assume two things. One is that occupied sites can colonize neighboring sites, right? So that, for example, if I have here two neighboring sites, and this is occupied, with some probability of colonization, that's the standard term that is used, it might happen that my neighbor gets colonized also, right? Of course, if my neighbor is surrounded, this empty site is surrounded by more and more field places occupied by the species, it's more and more likely that I actually get colonized. And on the other hand, right, because of different kinds of environmental stochasticities, right, intrinsic and extrinsic, with some probability of extinction, right, a given occupied site becomes empty, right? Can be reoccupied, but becomes empty, right? These are the simple rules that were introduced a while ago, and is usually known as Levin's model. Okay? Levin's model introduced these basic rules, and in this fragmentation model, we add here this new quantity, one parameter that tells you the fraction of sites that cannot be occupied. So making a model of this is not difficult, right? Not difficult at all, because actually what you can do is the following. This is a system, and now let's forget for a moment about the lattice. Just imagine that I have a total possible number of sites that could be completely mixed in this model. And I'm going to assume the following. As usual, it's convenient to think in terms of fractions of things, right? For me, x is the number of sites divided by the total, right? That I'm going to use that. So the fraction is between 0 and 1, okay? And the same is going to happen with the empty sites and the destroyed sites. Remember, this is just a parameter between 0 and 1 again, okay? So, how is this going to change in time? Well, on the one hand is a growth part of the system that works as follows. It's very intuitive, right? C tells me growth rate, right? How can I expand into what is not occupied? So I'm going to grow, right? And remember the logistic model. The logistic model, what we did was I grow, right? Let me write down the equation here just to remember. In the logistic model, right? We had a growth term here and a term that tells me where can I expand, how much space I have to expand. This is the fraction of the available population that is still not occupied, right? And here's exactly the same, except that the total amount I can occupy is not 1. It's 1 minus d, right? But essentially it's logistic, okay? I will grow into what is not filled, right? So this is the fraction of empty sites. And I'm going to grow, again, if I find out a place to grow. And independently of that, right, there's an additional term which has to do with this, extinction, right? Since extinction doesn't depend on neighbors or anything, that's my model, okay? That's the model, Levin's model, including habitat fragmentation or habitat loss, right? Okay, so in this way, I have introduced the extinction part and the habitat loss part, right? Everything is here. Again, there's a number of possibilities on expanding this model and making it more sophisticated, but essentially it captures the really interesting stuff. Why is this model going to tell us something that is not clearly obvious, right? Well, that's something that we find out in natural systems. One thing that you can find is that take a species that lives in a given habitat, okay? Imagine that I destroy half of it. But half of the potential places where the species can live, it's gone. What would be your conclusion? The obvious conclusion is, if the population initially was 1 million, when I remove half of the habitat, I will have 500,000. I'm going to show you in a moment that this is not the case. And that's what has been observed in a number of instances. You remove habitat, right? And there's a threshold where the species cannot persist anymore, despite the fact that you have still available habitat, okay? To show you that, let me do the following. This is a standard model, so we can work out with no problem. Actually, let me say two things. One is that we have already seen this model, okay? This is mathematically equivalent to the epidemic spreading model that we explore when we analyze the simplest way of approaching epidemics, okay? There's part of the story that has to do with contagion, right? Contagion here is invading, affecting, and changing the empty cells, right? And there was a recovery process, right, where you go back into a state. Mathematically, conceptually is very different. Mathematically is equivalent. So everything that we learned there, we can apply it here, okay? All right. The second thing is that actually, I was saying this is a kind of a logistic model, right? And it is, strictly speaking, because this here, actually, if I put it all together under the same parenthesis, can actually be written in this way. Okay? So essentially it's something that involves the growth term and a term that has to do with saturation. Except, and that's the difference here, that this thing here can be positive or negative, right? That makes a difference, okay? Very good. Well, if you analyze the system, you have two potential fixed points. One, and that's why the title, Extinction, okay, is that the species gets extinct, okay? The second, the non-trivial one, is this one here, okay? This species is there, right? Provided that this quantity here is positive, okay? So this actually leads into something that is already interesting. Remember that we have two fixed points in one of these one-dimensional nonlinear systems. When one is stable, the other is unstable. It might happen it doesn't exist, right? But anyway, they exchange stability, all right? Well, you can show that extinction is going to be stable. It will be the point where you observe extinction if the amount of habitat destroyed is larger than this, okay? In this case, it's too much destruction and I'm going to lose this species, right? This is already something that needs to make you think, because this quantity here, right, it typically is not going to be larger than 1, right? If E and C, if this balance is less than 1, I will have a number here that is not 1. So I don't have this to destroy everything. If I destroy enough, okay, this will lead to extinction. And that's what I'm going to call my critical destruction level, right? For systems like this, where I exchange stability, I can say this is the condition for, stability, right? And of course, this is going to be stable the other way around. If habitat destruction is less, let me put this already this way, the critical value, right? This population will be stable, okay? All right, I can express this using a bifurcation diagram. Well, remember, I'll put together all the information about the system. My parameter here is going to be habitat loss, and here we'll put the fixed points, the equilibrium points for my system, right? If habitat destruction is 0, okay, what I'm going to have, this will be 1 minus E over C. As you can see, there's already a condition about this. E has to be less than C, right? Okay. So if I increase D, this is a linear function, right? This is just something that decays with D. All right? So the amount of population that is occupying my habitat is going to decrease, right? The one might be far away from here, right? But the point is that there's a critical level that no matter what, right, defines the situation where my population gets extinct. Let me write this clearly here, right? This is the fixed point here, stable. Habitat is enough to survive. This region here will be for x0 equals, x equals 0 stable, so there will be extinction domain. All right? And this situation here, of course, the x0 point is still there, but is unstable. No extinction, okay? So that's one first message we have from this, right? The idea that I make an impact, a negative impact in an ecosystem that grows in time in a continuous way doesn't mean the response of the system is going to be continuous, that it will have a population that decays slowly with destruction. There's a limit, and the limit is crucial actually to assess how much extinction, so how much fragmentation or habitat loss can I tolerate, all right? I can rewrite this in another way, okay? I'm going to make this just to make more consistent this connection with the epidemic models, right? I could actually look at how species propagate successfully if I think in terms of the colonization rate, you know, how easy it is for the species to colonize space. If I do that, and you can do exactly the same analysis and write down this bifurcation diagram, okay, what you will find is that in terms of this parameter, I need, with all other parameters fixed, right, I need to cross a given, for a given D, for a given E, right, I need to cross a boundary, right, the critical value, that you can find, okay, where essentially move from a domain where I cannot propagate into the system to a domain where I can actually successfully spread, all right? So, as an exercise for you, find out what is the critical C values and construct this bifurcation diagram. But clearly, again, this is something that we have already seen when we analyze epidemic spreading. There is a threshold that allows things to propagate that is exactly the same in terms of the formal expression that we saw in epidemic spreading. How is this idea going to be relevant for us in terms of applying into understanding disease, right? We will see in another seminar on mathematical oncology that what we just found here is precisely what we need to explain how a class of therapy that has been used in cancer and is now being explored, it's called differentiation therapy, can be understood. The particular things that can be observed in the clinical data can be understood in terms of a process of habitat loss, where there's no habitat loss, is the number of differentiated cells that will play the role of the available habitat or the forbidden habitat, where this term here will involve chemotherapy, right? The destruction of cells by a process that is external to anything to do with cancer cell interactions. And this here will be defined by the amount of cells that the therapy has been able to convert into cells that cannot replicate. And thanks to this kind of model, we could explain some tricky observations about how the therapy actually gets successful or not.